In our last video, we looked at how during Reconstruction, when Black citizens gained the right to vote, those votes led to an increase in the number of Black officials being elected, right? Well, from 0 up to more than 0. And those Black officials then did additional taxes and public spending that benefited the Black population and helped close Black-white literacy gaps. Then when Reconstruction ended and the Black population became disenfranchised again, those gains disappeared. The additional public spending went back down, those additional public goods disappeared, and that way of sort of starting to close the Black-white inequality disappeared with it. So the way that the Black population became disenfranchised was, remember, through these poll tax and literacy test type laws. So we still have the 15th Amendment on the books. That 15th Amendment still says that you can't discriminate on the basis of race when it comes to the right to vote. So you can't have a law on the books that says that you must be white and male to vote at the time. You can still have a law that says you have to be male to vote. So what I want to talk about in this video is really those literacy test components, right? So we talked about how the poll tax was a way to disproportionately disenfranchise Black voters even after the 15th Amendment because the Black population had lower incomes and less wealth on average than the white population, particularly in the late 1800s. The literacy tests are going to do something similar, right? Because there's differences in average literacy levels between white and Black populations, right? Because we've had horrible school systems or no school systems for the Black population for decades at this point. But they're going to have another way that they disenfranchise Black voters as well. And that's going to bring us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is going to be this critical moment where we do away with these literacy tests and their disparate impact on the Black population. And we're going to look at another paper by Cascio and Washington that asks a very similar question to that Logan paper on Reconstruction. When we do away with these literacy tests and we enfranchise Black voters again, what happens to public spending, public goods, and the benefits that the Black population gets from those public spending? Okay? So before we get to that paper, let's dig back into this notion of the literacy tests that came in after Reconstruction to disenfranchise Black voters. So if we think about when these literacy tests first start popping up, remember, a literacy test is simply saying you must be literate in order to vote. And so you have to prove you're literate to vote. Well, if we look at, say, 1880, so just after Reconstruction here, as we're heading into this Jim Crow era, you can see that these literacy tests are clearly going to have a disparate impact on the Black population because in 1880, the Black population has a 70% illiteracy rate compared to about a 10% illiteracy rate for the white population. So in 1880, simply imposing a literacy test in order to vote is going to disenfranchise 7 out of 10 Black voters and only 1 out of 10 white voters. And so it's really going to skew the voting eligible population toward the white population, right? So I said this is going to lead us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, if on this graph we look at 1965, now these illiteracy rates are fairly low or very low for both the Black and white population. So it's only a small fraction of either population that's going to be disenfranchised by a literacy law. And so you might wonder, how does the repeal of these literacy tests have any real impact by 1965? I think from this graph, it would be obvious how they'd have an impact at the turn of the century, less obvious in 1965. So to understand that, you really have to know how these literacy tests work in practice. It turns out there's a lot of discretion of the official registering the voter as to how they test this voter's literacy, or this potential voter's literacy. So let's take a look at this. One way that this would commonly take place is you'd say, all right, come into the office. I'm going to pick out a passage from the Virginia Constitution or the Virginia Code, and you read it back to me. Okay? So you can justify this as sort of, if we have people voting, right, they should know what they're voting on. They should be an informed voter. They should understand the laws of our state. And so asking them to read the Constitution, read a bit of code, makes perfect sense. Okay? So that's your superficial justification. But in practice, this is really being used to discriminate against black voters. And here's how this would happen. All right? So I, a white potential voter, I'm going to walk in to the registrar's office here and say, I'd like to vote. I say, we're going to give you a literacy test first. Please read this passage from the Virginia Code. So this is an actual passage that I pulled up from the Virginia Code, section 1508. Right? And so I'm just going to read it out loud here. The director of the Department of General Services shall have available at all times flags of the Commonwealth to be offered for sale to the public in such manner as the director may determine. So there we go. I passed my literacy test and I can go vote. Seems simple enough. Now a black voter comes in after me, and now the official scans a little bit further down the Virginia Code, and in the same page, they come across this, right? So the same page is also describing flags and seals. There's a great seal, there's a lesser seal, there's all kinds of stuff, right? But they say, all right, here's a passage from Virginia State Code. Please read this out loud, all right? So I'm not going to bore you by reading this thing in its entirety, but just skipping through it, we've got things about 2 metallic discs, 2 1/4 inches in diameter, ornamental borders. We've got the obverse vertis, the genius of the Commonwealth dressed as an Amazon, right? There's the word perizonium, which I have no idea what that actually is, right? So this is going on and on and on. We can see at the end here, he's got his fallen crown nearby, a broken chain in his left hand, and a scourge in his right. This passage keeps going on, right? So now we have Latin that I have to read back, where the motto Sic Semper Tyrannis is there. I don't know if you've ever seen our state seal, but it's a guy stepping on another guy saying this, right? And then we've got on her right, Eternatus with a globe and phoenix in her right hand. On the left of Libertas Ceres and a cornucopia in her left hand with an ear of wheat in her right. Over this device in a curved line, the word perseverando. I have no idea if I pronounced half those words correctly. I could very well have failed this literacy test, right? So they could choose a passage of the code that was horribly complex, difficult to read, and at the slightest mispronunciation, slightest pause, you say, illiterate, right? And so that sort of discrimination, how the test is administered, is what really made it a way to disenfranchise black voters. So it's not just about these differences in actual literacy rates, right? It's about how they're using that test to sort of create fake differences in literacy rates. Okay, so that's one way to do it, all right? But let's point out what actually happened in Virginia according to the Constitution. So it's not just you have to read this section of the Constitution, as I just said, right? But they've sort of built in something that makes it even easier to discriminate against people, right? In this case, specifically against black potential voters. So this is from the 1902 Virginia Constitution here, and it's showing who's eligible to vote. So at such registrations, this is voter registration, every male citizen of the United States having the qualifications of age and residence required in Section 18 shall be entitled to register to vote if he be, and then there's this long list of ways that you can be eligible. And so one of the last things in this list is a person able to read any section of this Constitution submitted to him by the officers of registration. Okay, so that's what I just showed you. You can be very discriminatory in terms of what the officer of registration decides to give you, right? But notice this extra clause here, and to give a reasonable explanation of the same, all right? And then they say, oh, you don't even have to read the section. You just have to be able to understand and give me a reasonable explanation thereof when I read it to you, okay? Well, that's generous, right? Not really, okay? Because if I throw out this section of the code to you, and so here we're talking about treatment of securitization transactions. Once again, this is actual Virginia code. So it says nothing contained in this chapter shall be deemed to require any securitization transaction to be treated as a sale for federal or state tax purposes or to preclude the treatment of any securitization transaction as debt for federal or state purposes or to change any applicable laws relating to the perfection and priority of security of ownership interests of persons other than the transferor, hypothetical lien creditor, or in any or in the event of bankruptcy, receivership, or other insolvency proceedings with respect to the transfer or its property, bankruptcy trustee, receiver, debtor, debtor in possession, or similar person. Go ahead and hit pause on the video and try to give me a layman's explanation of what I just read to you. And I doubt you're going to be able to. I would not be able to. Okay? Once again, I'm functionally illiterate as far as they're concerned when it comes to voter registration. So you can see how discriminatory this was and how it could still be used in a discriminatory manner by 1965. So what happens in 1965? In 1965, we get the Voting Rights Act. So there's LBJ signing this into law, right? And what the Voting Rights Act is going to do is basically cut out all this nonsense about using laws selectively to disenfranchise black voters. All right. So it's both going to get rid of these types of laws that restrict voting in sort of discriminatory ways. It's also going to be a response to voter intimidation that was happening, right? So intimidating black potential voters from coming in and registering to vote. So it sends federal examiners down largely throughout the South to register voters, right? Taking this kind of out of the hands of the local jurisdictions. It's also going to figure out which jurisdictions have a history of discrimination. They get special scrutiny under the law, and that special scrutiny was still in place whenever they tried to change the voter laws, right, up until very recently, in fact. Okay, so this has been something that's been hotly debated in the past few years, the relaxing of that special scrutiny. So all these things combined had this dramatic effect on how many black citizens were registered to vote. And then that subsequently led to a dramatic increase in actual black voting. Right? So I want to give you some of the specifics here so you can see how they pulled these literacy tests out, made them illegal. Right? So here's language from the Voting Rights Act that no citizen shall be denied because of his failure to comply with any test or device the right to vote in any federal, state, or local election. Right? And so test or device, they very explicitly say here, right, that this could include demonstrating the ability to read, write, understand, or interpret any manner, demonstrate any educational achievement or knowledge of a particular subject, right? And so you can see how in those phrases that was leaving local officials all of this leeway with how to discriminate. And so we're taking that all away with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay? So did this have impacts? Had huge impacts, right? So let's look at voter turnout in presidential elections. This is a figure that came from the Washington Post. So this is 1952 up to 2012, right? You've got 4 different lines here. You've got black Southerners, black Northerners, white Southerners, white Northerners, okay? So if you look at black Northerners and white Northerners, there's higher voter turnout for white Northerners than black Northerners, but they're roughly at comparable levels compared to the other things going on in this graph, right? And just sort of stay around those same levels from the 1950s up to this century, okay? White Southerners have also always been up around that same level, right? We never have 100% voter turnout, right? So that 60% turnout, 65% turnout is what we expect, and that's what we see for all 3 of those groups for the last half century, right? Where this disenfranchisement through things like poll taxes and literacy laws was really taking place was in the South, right? That's where Jim Crow laws were particularly pernicious, right? And so here you can see black Southerners in 1952 nearly completely disenfranchised, either because they weren't eligible to vote or they were intimidated when it came to voting. You've got a number here that's less than 10% voting. Okay, so think about how dramatically disenfranchised that population is and how little the political system and sort of legislation is going to be responsive to that population as a result. Okay? And so then our Voting Rights Act comes in right here, and you can see that huge change in voter participation. Okay? It's important to know that this percentage here, this voter turnout, is relative to the sort of voting age population, not to registered voters. right? Because that discrimination was taking place at the registration stage as well as at the polls. All right. So now to the specific paper I want to talk about for the rest of this video. This is a paper by Casco and Washington in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and what they want to look at is whether this enfranchisement from the black population, which led to a big increase in black voter turnout, then led to an increase in the share of public spending going toward that black population. Right? So very similar question that we tackled with the Logan paper, but in a very different time period. Okay? So they're going to talk about two basically political science reasons for why this might have been the case. Why the increased voter registration and participation of the black population should have led to more public spending benefiting that black population. So the first is models of identity politics. So the basic idea here is that voters elect representatives that share their ideology. And so when those representatives then enact legislation in accordance with their ideology, since it's shared with you, it benefits you, right? So that's the basic story behind the identity politics channel. The other channel is distributive politics, okay? And so this channel is where politicians are going to distribute resources to clearly identifiable constituent groups to maximize votes, right? So if there's this big group of voters and you know what they want, give them what they want so that you get their votes. Right? So there's this very kind of transactional sense of what's going on. So Casco and Washington, without doing anything really empirically about it, right, they're going to dismiss the first story here, this identity politics story. And the reason is, they point out, you don't actually see an immediate jump in the number of black officials being elected. All right, the number of black representatives being elected. And they discuss this in the paper, but part of the reason is that one thing that's still going on is gerrymandering and redistricting in a way that breaks up the power of the black voting bloc. And that actually makes it much harder for black representatives to get elected. Rules are going to change for that, but they're going to change way down the road. Okay? So they're going to say the second channel is probably the relevant story for right after the Voting Rights Act. And so that's what they're sort of focused on, right? And so the idea then is that you suddenly enfranchised this black population. And so counties with a larger black population, right, just got a bigger shock to who the relevant voters are. And so under this distributive politics model, if you're in a county that had almost no black voters, or almost no black individuals, and then the VRA comes along, that's still a very small voting bloc. You don't really redistribute much to them. Their votes aren't important to you. If you're in a county that has a large black population, you suddenly get this big new constituent group with voting power, and so you're going to redistribute resources to that group to secure their vote in the next election. Okay? That's the basic idea they want to test. So how would we go about doing this? The really simple thing would be to say, in counties where there's large black population shares, once the VRA passes, do we see a sudden shift in resources going to that black population? Okay, so that would be the really simple way to do this. So in that sort of idea, we'd be regressing public spending going to the black population in the county on county black population and seeing if there's a big change after 1965. Okay? You could think of other variables that might matter here, right? So maybe there's other proxies of economic status of black voters or other proxies for public goods that might be relevant, but that's the basic idea. Problem is that's not going to work, right? And that's not going to work for the same reason we had when we talked about the Logan paper in the previous video. So it's not going to work because counties that have large black population shares differ for all sorts of reasons from counties that have small black population shares. And so how those counties are changing over time, right, might be due to those very different underlying characteristics than the Voting Rights Act itself. Okay? So this is our basic problem. That's the same basic problem we had in Logan's paper, where he said counties that elect black politicians are going to be different along a lot of dimensions than counties that don't. So how do we attribute the effect of a black politician to the politician and not to those other characteristics? In the Logan paper, we talked about this instrumental variables approach. That's not what we're going to do here. What we're going to do here is something fancy we call a triple differences. I'll explain that more in a second. But the basic idea is to exploit the elimination of these literacy tests. Okay? So the idea here is that you've got counties with large black population shares in states that had a literacy test that got suddenly eliminated with the Voting Rights Act. You have counties with large black population shares in states that didn't have a literacy test, right? So the impact of the Voting Rights Act is going to be much bigger in that state where you had the literacy test, which was a much bigger imposition to black voting. Okay? So the idea then is to see if the impact of this Voting Rights Act was actually larger when we estimate these things in states with literacy tests than without. Right? Because you can match on most other dimensions, and so now we can say, well, the only substantive difference between these counties that look the same along all these other dimensions is one had a literacy test, one didn't. So one had this huge impediment to black voting, the other didn't. So what's going to change differentially for them when the Voting Rights Act comes in? Well, the only major differential change between them is you suddenly got a bunch more black voters in this one that had the literacy test. Okay? So that's the basic idea they're going to go with. On the eve of the Voting Rights Act, we still have literacy tests in place in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, both Carolinas, and Virginia, right? So these are the states that should see the biggest impact. All right, so let's get a little more technical about what we mean by these triple differences. So this is the basic regression equation that Cascio and Washington are going to use. Right? So on the left-hand side, we've got the change in the log of our outcomes. So this could be like spending per capita, like we have in the Logan paper, right? Or taxes per capita. So that's our first difference. Okay? So it's saying how has the log of, say, spending per capita in county C and state S changed over time? Changed between 1960 and 1980. Okay, that's difference number one. So the next difference is going to be comparing counties with a high black population share to counties with a small black population share. Okay, so we've got this PCT black here, which is the black population share in county C. All right, so this coefficient mu is telling us, did that change in spending per capita over time differ between low black population share and high black population share counties? So that's our second difference. Okay, so compare over time, first difference, the difference between high black, low black population share counties, our second difference. Okay, so our third difference is now about that literacy test. So our third difference is saying the change over time should have a stronger relationship with black population share if you had a literacy test in place right before the VRA, right? Because those are going to be the counties with the biggest change in the actual black voter population, okay? So this slope coefficient mu, right, the coefficient that captures how spending's changing in counties as you change the black population share, that slope coefficient should get bigger when you switch from a no literacy test state to a literacy test state. So that's what this theta is capturing. That's our third difference. So I realize that's all pretty complicated. That takes a lot to absorb, and it's always very difficult even for me to explain it. But that's the basic idea of what's going on here. Okay, we know spending or some other measures changing over time. We want to see if that change is bigger or smaller in these counties with large black population shares, right? And we think that that relationship between the change over time and county black population share should depend on this third difference, whether you had a literacy test or not in place, okay? So what happens? Let's just go over the actual results here. So first of all, did we see differential change on voter turnout itself between states with literacy tests and without? Okay, so here your solid circles are states with literacy tests, your open circles are states without a literacy test, okay? And then you've got your vertical line here showing you when the Voting Rights Act passes, okay? So what you can see is that before it passes, you have far lower presidential election turnout rates in states with literacy tests compared to states without. And after it passes, that goes much closer together. All right, so that kind of lines up with our thinking. That means that Catskill and Washington are on the right track here. Right? It does look like that literacy test was really suppressing the black vote prior to the Voting Rights Act. And so the VRA is going to open up a huge new block of black voters in those states compared to states that didn't have a literacy test. Okay? And that shows up in the gubernatorial elections as well. So now what about actual outcomes here? Are the politicians responding to this change in voter turnout? Well, these per capita state transfers, all right, Catskill and Washington are going to argue in the paper that the way they're measuring these state transfers is capturing sort of funds that are particularly useful to black households. All right, so that would be something that a politician, a legislator, could increase in order to garner the black vote. All right, so you can see before the VRA, right, the states with literacy tests, you have much lower levels here. Okay, compared to after the VRA, that flips. Okay, so it looks like legislators are changing their priorities, changing what they're doing after the VRA in a way that's different for those states with literacy tests than without, right? And so the way to think about this is that these politicians in states without literacy tests already had to cater to some extent to the black population. In states with literacy tests, they really didn't. So when the literacy test is removed, it's those states that had it where we're going to see a big change in politicians' behavior in favor of doing things that benefit that black population because of their newfound rights to vote there. Okay. We can do this in a regression framework as well. I don't really want to dwell on this, but remember that coefficient theta over here, right? That's picking up this final difference between literacy test states and non-literacy test states. And these are those theta coefficients, and you can see they don't become significant until after the Voting Rights Act, right? So this is not something about kind of fundamental differences we haven't gotten rid of between these states, right? That literacy test, right, the way it matters is really pre versus post Voting Rights Act. So the final thing we can look at here is, well, does this change in politician behavior matter? Does it benefit the black population? Does it help close these black-white gaps that we've talked about in terms of inequality and mobility? Okay? So this table gives us a sense of that, right? So we can look at basically what's the change in this, just focus on this reduced form line here, okay? What that's basically showing us is how much did this gain in black voting rights as sort of proxied by having a larger black population share and having this literacy test holding back that voting block beforehand, so this coefficient's capturing, okay? How does that impact our outcome variables? Okay, so if we get a positive coefficient down here, right, this is being interpreted as the enfranchisement of a larger share of black voters, right, has a positive impact on, in this case, state transfers to that county in terms of log per capita state transfers. It has a positive impact on school spending in that county. So you enfranchise more black voters, you get more school spending, right? And that's one of these key channels for upward mobility and closing gaps, right? So what you look at here is a black-white difference in the pupil-teacher ratio. You can see this one goes negative. And that means that black schools are getting better, right? Because we're getting a lower pupil to teacher ratio, okay? Fewer kids per teacher. And then this final one over here, so we don't get a significant effect on the dissimilarity index. This is a measure of residential segregation. This last coefficient here is showing that we see this increase, right, in enrollment rates, okay? So all this is to say that it's not just kind of useless spending or shifting things around. What changes when we enfranchise the black population in these southern states is that politicians now have to take their needs into consideration, and that translates into greater public spending that in particular is benefiting black educational opportunities here, which is that key mechanism for mobility and closing those black-white gaps. So really fascinating study, just underscoring the importance of voting and the importance of legislation and federal programs in terms of what leads to inequality or what leads to reducing that inequality and generating additional mobility.